So I sold all my Sony gear and bought a Nikon Z6 with an Atomos Ninja V recorder. Now why would anybody do that? Well, let's find out in my long-term review of the Nikon Z6 and Atomos Ninja V. Here we go. This is my dad. Now he is a 72-year-old ski bum. There's no other way to put it. Now each year he goes down to Austria from Scandinavia and he spends a few months there. Every day he hikes for a few hours just to get those perfect powder runs, and he's been doing so for almost 50 years. So one of my passion projects this year was to capture my adventurous dad doing what he loves to do the most. And so I booked a flight, I got my big brother to go with me, and off to Austria we went. And the forecast looks just awesome. We had a lot of snow coming down just before we got there, and I had packed my Sony a7R II, I packed my Sony FS5, I packed all my zoom lenses, and I packed my Atomos Shogun Inferno. But when we finally hit the slopes and I had about 10 to 15 kilos of camera gear on my back and we hiked for a few hours out in the deep powder in the off-piste, a problem started to emerge.
Oh, it's tough, but it's fun.
Every time we switched locations, I had to turn my whole FS5 rig down and then assemble it again. And like when you're out in a meter deep snow and you suddenly realize that I need to be 5 meters that way or maybe 10 meters up the slope, that starts to become a bit of a problem. And also some days I simply didn't have the backpack real estate to pack both my FS5 and my A7R II. So when I came back, a thought started emerging. I need something that can do both video and stills at the same time. I don't want to have to switch lenses between the two cameras or tear one camera down just to put the other one up. I want to be able to shoot as much as possible and easily switch between videos and stills. So I started looking around for the best hybrid camera that could suit my needs, and this is what I ended up with. So when I set out to find a really good hybrid camera, I had a few criteria since I moved from a dedicated video camera, and that was a good assortment of lenses and at least a 10-bit output with a log profile, preferably even RAW if that was at all possible, and I also wanted no cropping on the sensor when shooting in 30 FPS or below. So what I ended up with were basically 3 cameras, and that was Nikon Z6, Panasonic's S1, and the only at that point hinted at Panasonic S1H. Now the Panasonics have access to a great variety of lenses with Sigma's MC21 adapter, so that goes from EF to the L mount, so you can adapt almost all EF lenses and you will get autofocus support on the S1. But if you then take a look at on the Nikon side, the Z6 has some native C-mount lenses, but almost all Nikon's F-mount lenses works just fine with the FTC adapter, and I don't really get like all the criticism you see online that the S1 and especially the Z6 don't have any native glass. For all intents and purposes, the F glass works just as good as native glass on the Z6. At least that's my experience with eye tracking, autofocus working really good in bright situations, and yeah, basically no issues at all from the lenses that I've used. And since the Z6 has the shortest flange distance out of all mirrorless cameras out there, fun fact, you can now adapt both EF glass and you get autofocus on the Z6, and you can even adapt E-mount lenses from the Sony side and get eye tracking autofocus, which is kind of mind-blowing. And thanks to that short flange distance, there is pretty much not a lens ever made, maybe with a few exceptions, that doesn't work with an adapter on the Z6, and that is really important to me because I like to use a lot. I have a lot of choice in the lenses that I can use on different projects. Now, of course, the S1H shoots 4K 60, albeit at a crop, and it does 10-bit internally, but if you do get a 1.6 times crop, then I have to start switching lenses to get the same field of view when I want to shoot 4K 60, and that just becomes like a hassle. So for me, 1080 60p and not getting a crop like I get on the Z6 sometimes actually works better. So I ended up with the Z6. Big surprise, right? Because of the title of the video, and well, you get it. So I ended up with the Z6 for a couple of reasons, but the main one being that it was almost 1,000 euros cheaper than the S1 at the time, and that included the FTC adapter, by the way. And for that 1,000 euros, I was able to buy a used Nikon 24-70 2.8 with autofocus and a 70-200 2.8 VR lens, and that is basically a really good starting kit at 2.8. You could get some really good pictures with that. So, and the second big feature, and I know you shouldn't buy stuff like the guys over at like The Verge and all other big like regular tech site will tell you, don't buy gear on future feature updates, but 12-bit ProRes RAW, especially since I had that on the FS5 and I know just how good 12-bit looks, that was probably enough to put me over the edge. So Nikon, any day now, give us that ProRes RAW update. We've been waiting like for more than a year now. Come on. Alright, so let's get into what actually makes the Z6 a great camera. And the most important part of any camera is how the images coming out of the camera looks. And on the Z6, I'm happy to say that it doesn't disappoint. The pictures that I get out of this camera straight out of the box looks really great on the still side. The skin tones, just take a look at a few of these examples, look really great. I think that the 24 megapixels is more than fine to produce really sharp and good results for almost any project you throw at it. One other thing that I really enjoyed and I was a bit surprised by coming from the Sony side is just how good the ergonomics of the Z6 is. It fits like really good in your hand without being too bulky. If you compare the Z6 size-wise to the S1 and the S1H, those are really much bigger cameras, which will give you maybe like more problems on gimbals and whatnot. I still in the mirrorless form factor, but the buttons on this are really intuitive, laid out for me coming from Sony. So one of the best features of the Z6 that I really enjoy is that you can switch between the stills mode and the video mode, and the settings are totally isolated, which is really good. So you can have your log profile on your video settings and Also, since the native ISO on N-Log is ISO 800, and maybe if I'm switching over to stills, I want to be on ISO 100, I can have completely different settings in the same location. So that is a really nice feature of the C6. I saw a lot of complaining on the C6 that I felt like I get where they're coming from, but I think that a lot of people buying the C6 are considering buying an Atomos Ninja V as well. And sure, there are, especially coming from the FS5 like I did, there are a lot of video features missing on the C6, but those are pretty much mitigated when you use the Ninja V. As I mentioned before, one of the biggest perks of the C6 is the C-mount. Here I have my old Mamiya 645 macro lens, which has a good, like, I think 1:1 macro. And check this out, this is actually a tilt shift adapter, so I can tilt and shift this to my leisure. When I do product photography, I basically fell in love with tilt shift lenses back in photography school when we had those old technical cameras where you can pretty much shift the focal plane any way you wanted. So this has worked out really good for me, and these are relatively cheap to get. I like really enjoy this lens very much. If I were to buy a similar solution, this would probably cost me 4 times as much if I were to buy the Nikon or Canon equivalent to this lens. So really cool. So what do I miss from the FS5? Well, the XLRs with those excellent preamps are really good. I do miss having the ability to plug in the FS5 to an outlet and run it for as long as I want it. And I do really feel that Nikon have a missed opportunity here, because you can charge the C6 with a power bank when it's off, but you can't run it off a power bank like you can with the S1. And this was almost a deal breaker for me, but when I actually got the C6, I do feel that the battery issues that I saw stated on some reviews were a bit overstated. I do think I get fair mileage out of my C6, and with a couple of batteries, it's not really an issue. But if you do really long interviews, that could be an issue for you. And the 30-minute recording cap is also something that I really wish that Nikon would have be able to work around. And also, of course, I missed the variable ND on the FS5. That thing is just amazing, and once you get used to that, it's really hard to go back to using regular ND filters on the outside of your lens. I just miss it so much. And also the hardware buttons that you get on a dedicated film camera when you're running and gunning, that is also something that I do miss. But the form factor of the C6 with the Ninja V and the quality I get, I think do weigh up some of those things that I traded away. So let's take a look at a couple of the must-have accessories for the C6. And first and foremost on the list, since I'm actually filming on my own C6 with the Ninja V right here, the FTC adapter is probably the most important adapter accessory to get to your C6, because that gives you access to the entire Nikon F mount lens series, which they are spectacularly good lenses, and the used market for them is really good. I think that Nikon lenses, at least in Europe, are a bit cheaper compared to their Canon counterparts, so that is really good. And also the second accessory I would recommend is, at least if you're into video, that would be the Ninja V that I just showed you, and then I think you should buy a cage. Here I have the SmallRigs Halfcage on this camera that I borrowed from a friend. He generously lent his camera to me so that I could film with my own C6 and still have a C6 to show. So that is the Halfcage, and on my personal camera I have the Halfcage, which has some really cool features that you can actually take the camera out of the cage, and it has a quick release system, so you still get good mounting points if you move it to a different tripod, but it also has the Manfrotto style quick release, so you can take your camera on of one rig and still just slide it into any Manfrotto head and you're good to go. So, to conclude, I think that the C6 is a great choice for all you hybrid shooters out there. The stills look fantastic when you have the right lenses on the C6, and the N-Log, you can get some really nice skin tones out of that profile, and overall the C6 is a great camera thanks to its good ergonomics to work with, and it hasn't disappointed me in any of the situations that I've thrown at it. Anything from shooting stand-up paddle boarding and using a waterproof bag, to being in the studio and shooting still life and what have you. It has all worked out simply great for me. So that's it for my long-term review of the Nikon Z6. I hope you enjoyed it. I will do a new video when the ProRes RAW update comes out, when it finally does. But in the meantime, that's it for me, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button if you like this video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.